Hello, everybody. I am Mary Fleece. I'm here with my colleagues, Jim McIntyre and Josh Fulton. And I can allow them, if they'd like to introduce themselves more in a moment, they can. I teach history and political science and sociology here at the college. And we are here to discuss the book by our One Book, One College for this year, 1919 by Eve Ewing. Which is a compilation of sorts, a volume of poetry related to the race riots in Chicago in 1919. So with that, I'll allow my colleagues to introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there.
I'm Jim McIntyre. I'm also one of the members of the history department, here to discuss the connection between race and violence in American history.
All right, and I'm Josh Fulton. I am another member of the history faculty here at Moraine Valley, and as well interested to kind of discuss how this particular series of poems, connects not only to 1919, but what connections we can make to today.
Right. And the three of us were talking earlier just about the idea that, I don't know if it's so much as a caveat, but just an understanding of the fact that the three of us are three Caucasian professors talking about a subject that's related to African American history. And so I think maybe what I'd say, for speaking for myself, is I'm doing the best I can here, and acknowledging that there are obviously gaps in the things that I could never know and never experience, not being a person of color myself. So, okay, so one of the things that we were talking about before was just these core themes that seem to kind of stand out in this book all the way through. That relate, obviously, that correlate from 1919 to now. And I don't know if we want to start off by talking a little bit about 1919, or just should we assume that the audience probably knows a little bit something about this, or do one of you want to maybe just talk about briefly, or I can briefly about what happened?
Yeah, maybe if we want to give a quick overview,
Sure.
you or Jim, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
This is your area of expertise, sir. World War I and just after. I will yield the floor, my friend.
All right.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I'll say one thing. You jump in whenever to clarify whatever I need to say. So the story surrounds basically 17-year-old Eugene Williams, who was swimming it was July 1919 in Lake Michigan. In what I always tell my students that surprises them, the whites-only section of Lake Michigan. And students usually always, their eyebrows go up when they have the whites-only section. We seem to have this perception that, segregation was only occurring down in the South, and that there was this beautiful utopia that existed up north, this land of, freedom and milk and honey.
Sure.
And it wasn't quite that way. And Eugene was swimming, ventured over into the white section of the lake, and was subsequently stoned by various people in the crowd there and drowned. And his drowning then was obviously witnessed by a crowd of people, both black and white, who asked basically for there to be the people in the crowd that threw the stones were white. They recognized them. These are the people who did it. And the police did not arrest anybody, which led to about 3 days of rioting throughout the city that left countless, tens of people dead and millions of dollars in damage. And it was just a kind of not the brightest moment, the happiest moment in Chicago history. So, you want to add anything to that, Josh?
Sure. I mean, the thing that I would add, or the things that I would add, would be sort of contextual, perhaps, around that. Of 1919. Really, I'm sure that we often all have to have discussions with our students on, whether or not dates matter, and they don't really, so long as you kind of, to borrow a phrase from a professor and colleague that Jim Braywell, Wayne Lee, there's sort of coat hooks or hooks to kind of to kind of move things along, and certainly 1919 is one of those years. So you have the Great Migration, that has been occurring and is occurring. You've got the end of World War I. You've got tens of thousands of folks coming back to the city of Chicago, having spent sort of time away. You've got very large conversations going on in the city over the role of the state, kind of during that time. You've got the influenza pandemic, which the third wave is going to happen in 1919. You've got a large number of strikes that are happening in 1919, both in the city, not far from the places that you're talking about, and around the country, including a movement that basically occupies Seattle for a short period of time in 1919, which we can definitely, when we're talking about connections to 2020, get to that. So, I would argue that 1919 is, in addition to these, discussions that we're having on aspects of race and equity, is very much a contentious and politically charged time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would add in too that it also, I think, ties into, and we discussed this a bit beforehand, these other issues that are going on in the world, right? You have, along with the labor and the strikes, you have the communist revolution and resultant civil war in Russia, which is about to become the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so these connections too, to sort of broader global political change.
Yeah. I think, I was just rereading it actually, and a couple of the poems I had missed. And one of the themes that I think kind of jumped out at me, there's a poem called the Jump Rope poem, and it talks about how Eugene Williams went to the lake that morning, even though his mom told him not to go. She told him that, white kids can be mean and to be aware of that. And then she describes what happening to him as drowning, going down, the water's tugging at him and drowning him. And it reminded me, as I was reading it, of what we had alluded to earlier about in our previous discussion about Elijah McClain. But then I started reflecting on that further, and how the theme is kind of just surviving in the United States or in America while Black, right? This experience that goes back to the beginning, and what that must have been like to start off first as slaves coming over here, trying to maintain your heritage as best as your customs as much as you can on the quiet, so that you're not discovered and you're not punished, to later on to the post-Civil War era. I mean, I'm skipping, I don't mean to be skipping slavery, but the idea of having to hide a lot when you're, a slave, how you think, how you feel, how, everything in order to escape being punished. To the Jim Crow era, where pretty much, you look at a white person sideways, or you whistle at a white woman, or you just walk across the street the wrong way and you're lynched. Estimated 4,000 people lynched in the South during those years. And then coming up to the present, we're hearing all these stories recently of and we kind of barbecuing while Black, right? Because just what's a couple other ones, if you could think of any. That was the first one that came to my mind. But essentially, it's living while Black, right? Trying to walk into my house that I live in, into my condo with my key that I have, but having to prove that I live there.
Right.
Anyway, the point is, I would put in this category sort of just the idea of just surviving.
Right.
But that particular poem though reminded me of Elijah McClain, the young man whose story I think is not getting too much attention, in Colorado, who died last year before the pandemic, before George Floyd, but was walking home basically from a convenience store, and he was autistic, was wearing a ski hat, and was stopped by police because they said that he was flailing his arms about and seemed suspicious. But when they have the recorder and they're asking him questions, what comes out of his mouth is just completely indicative of his innocence, right? That he's saying, I'm an introvert. I don't mean any harm to anybody. I just want to go home. I live right here. And clearly indicating that there was obviously the young man had a disability. So to me, just resonated with me, just this idea of just I guess this particular poem of how you survive this experience while being a Black American. Anyone wants to jump off that?
Sure. If you don't mind, Jim. The two things, as you were speaking about this, Mary, and I thought from reading through some of the poems, the emotion and the emotional experience, that much of this poetry is very powerful, right? With that, the two things that I was thinking about is, as you're describing this idea of the history of living while Black, right? Obviously, this is something that none of us can relate to. Mm-hmm. But we can, I think, and should, especially with our students, and it's for other, faculty who would identify similarly, to have sort of real and open and frank discussions about the meanings of white privilege. Mm-hmm. And the manner in which I've always constructed this conversation with many of my students, 2020 aside, is being open and honest with them about the reality of normality, of that. it is, when some folks will hear the phrase privilege, they will think that that connotes a certain kind of sort of separate, when in reality it's the privilege of the normality of the life in which I live. It is not something that I created, but it is something that existed in the world after I was born and was born into it, and that kind of as you sort of say, not having to worry about walking to my house and trying to open it. You're not going to be accosted. You're not going to be asked about things. You're not going to be this. You're not going to be that. It is the privilege of the normal life in which you lead, right? That is that normality. And the second thing that I was kind of thinking about then, in looking back as you did at the beginning of that, is the 1619 Project, which, for those listening to this conversation, if you're not familiar with it, the 1619 Project was put out by the New York Times Magazine, I believe, about a year ago. And the idea was they brought together a number of historians and scholars of different disciplines, right, to talk about and to state that within our understanding of public history and the meaning of American identity, that we should take the foundation date of the United States and we should move it from 1775 or 76, wherever you sort of we might normally put it at, right? And we should put it to 1619 because of how centrally connected race has been to the American story from its founding. And whether you're someone who, if you've made it all the way through the 1619 Project or not, there's all these different sort of stories and little tangents to it. The thing that I sort of find interesting with it, for one, right, it's obviously a good conversation point, right, with students and this kind of thing, or with family and friends, but also how politicized it has become already.
Yeah.
It has become such a politicized aspect of, thinking about American identity over the course of the last year. I believe it's Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Correct me if I'm wrong. He introduced a bill basically to make the teaching of it in public school illegal. And like, oh, oops, okay, well, I guess I'm breaking the law according to Tom Cotton. I don't know, Senator Cotton. But those are at least the two things for me, that I was thinking about, kind of as you were speaking.
Well, and building off your second point, Josh, there's the idea that this is nothing new, right? Like, even, when I'm teaching the colonial period, I like to draw out the idea that you have these, ideas of conspiracy, of rebellions, slave revolts, but even just the idea, right, that, like, the one I was just looking for, there's a revolt that happens in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1700s when it was actually a freeman. Right? And again, that has students raising their eyebrows because we think the South and we think just slaves and free whites and that's it. But no, it's a very nuanced thing. But this idea of sort of trying to force this agenda, right, wherever there's even the perception of African Americans utilizing the rights that they, in theory and on paper, have, right? Because he was a freeman, he was a carpenter, and he was plying his trade, and this made the white establishment nervous. So there's all this discussion of a revolt, a conspiracy. There's never any proof of any of this, but it results in the trial and execution of like 20 people. And to me, that was where my mind went reading this 1919 book. Is like it's the same cycle repeated over and over again across the nation's history. And I think that also connects in with your point about the 1619 project.
Going back to Josh's point about the white privilege,
right?
I have had students get a little bit triggered by that statement, by the term white privilege. And we've had very frank discussions about it in American national government. And I've tried to explain just again, kind of what that means. It's kind of jumping off of what Josh was saying, but something that really resonated with me is, again, I can't know this as a white person female who lives in a relatively safe area, and I don't have to experience any type of crime ever, and I lead a very, very happy, safe life for the most part. But our colleague and my good friend Shalita Shaw had talked to me before about how her cousins and friends male cousins and friends, excuse me, when they drive with their wallets on the dashboard, always. And whenever I've shared that with people, like in Asian people, they stop and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that." Because it's not something that they have to think about. They don't have to think about where their wallet is, or if they reach for something, even just what happened just the other day in Kenosha, right? The video shows this man going to get into his car, his hands are visible. He's going to get into his car. He doesn't appear to be reaching for anything, at least that we can see. There was apparently a knife in the car, but they found that afterwards. They didn't know it was there before. And the officer begins to just grab his shirt and start shooting at him. And I think I try to make it as tangible as possible, because I think that that's something that is so often misunderstood, because people will always like default to, well, I never got any privilege. No one ever helped me. They take it as almost like you're negating their experience. And I think that we have to approach it in a different way with our students. I think not just with our students, I think with society in general. And I don't know if this like ties into like Robin, is it D'Angelo, the White Fragility books that she's written, but just the idea of people feeling that automatically that you're putting them on the spot, or that they're guilty of something, of having done something wrong. And I think if we can get to a point where we say, you haven't done anything wrong. You're not guilty of anything right now. You're not guilty of what was done 50 years ago or in 1619. But what you are guilty of, or what you are responsible for, is what you do moving forward, what you do or do not do moving forward in your own life, treat people and breaking those cycles. So.
What I'm hearing from you, Mary, is you didn't start it, but don't enable it. And I agree. In having these conversations with students, it can be unsettling, and we will hear that sort of, well, I don't benefit from this. How does it relate to me? And the manner in which I sort of try to talk about this, right, is the idea of being open and honest about my youth and my experiences growing up and this kind of thing. And I came from an upper middle class suburb that was over 95% white, and I remember as a kid, being able to walk around with other kids who were white with toy guns openly in the community. And this was the 80s, ancient history, but it was the 80s, and they looked like real guns. There was no orange tip to it, no this sort of that and the other. No one thought anything of it at all, and I didn't think anything of it then. And of it was, I'm out playing with my toy gun, and it's okay, right? But part of this, thinking back on it and speaking openly about the realities of it, is how, again, normal it can seem, and how normal privilege can be, or the these days of, if I'm going to walk out of a in a pre-COVID era, if I'm going to walk out of a Walmart and they're checking, I had this occasion happen, when they're checking receipts, right? And if they look at someone who is African American, and I remember that, like, so, sir, you have to come over here. I have to check your thing, and I walk over, and they go, no, you're fine, go ahead. And I go, no, you got to check mine too. If you're going to do this, you got to check mine too. Sort of that kind of thing, don't enable it. Don't enable it. But, in hearing both of you speak as well, I'm not certain, are either of you familiar? I believe is it State Representative LaShawn Ford, who recently proposed that there should actually be a ban on the teaching of history, because well, his point, so he's a state rep, his point is that clearly, and I think we all can agree on this, that when it comes to thinking about and teaching the history of race in America, for a large portion of our time, especially, from the 50s up through the 70s, 80s, much of that has been marginalized and ignored. And his point is that unless you can get to a sort of standpoint of equity in really looking at the role that race has played, well, then we should just stop teaching history. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that view. That seems a little bit, but, his point about how we need to look at how the history of Blackness, to the earlier point, has been ignored, I think is reasonable. We certainly need to be having that discussion, which the three of us are now, but. But yeah.
I had heard about that, but I had actually read a little bit more thoroughly. What I recall reading was he had proposed a sort of hiatus and
Right.
for the public schools in Illinois to revamp their curriculum to bring together, like bring in more diversity to
Yeah.
the teaching of history, which, I kind of smiled about because as we're discussing here, right, we're always looking just, something happens in the news, we think of something that we recall reading about, we go back and investigate and bring that into the curriculum to make help our students draw those connections out. I think some of it is that, and I think some of our responsibility as historians, and getting back to the book, right? The purpose of these poems was to serve as a kind of creative means of getting people to look into this history. Right? The author cites this sort of poem that I actually managed to find and download after these 1919 riots, and she touches on these a number of times through the poetry, right, and in the little preface to each poem, this massive report, right, that they had come up with after the riots, called the Negro in Chicago, and you can actually download the entire 800 plus pages. Um, at any rate, but using these poems as a means to pull students into the history, pull people into looking at the history creatively, rather than just here's a book that I've written based on these archival tracts and so forth, to generate our emotions first so that we want to find out what actually happened to inspire someone to develop these poems. But I think, as historians, that's kind of part of our makeup, part of our job description, really. So I think it kind of comes back to, good history is always going to be relevant. It's always going to resonate with something going on contemporaneously. That's all.
Yeah. Josh, piggybacking off of your earlier point,
Yeah.
You mentioned about being at Walmart or Costco. They do the same thing at Costco.
Right. Sure.
I keep mentioning poor Shalita. I'm going to have to pay her some royalties after this because I keep bringing her name up again and again in this conversation. But, we had very frank discussions about the fact that, and we've said it too, if we didn't work together, she and I are side by side, our desks are next to one another. And we just clicked from the moment that we met. But I will be honest, she's the first Black person that I've gotten. I mean, I've had, of course, people, acquaintances that I've worked with, but to be on a level where I consider her to be family and she considers me to be family.
Right.
Where my mom died and she was there that day. It's like that kind of a relationship.
Sure.
And so in that, we've had these frank discussions that I think have opened up my eyes a lot. And in turn, I've tried to expose my stepchildren to that and my nieces and nephews as well. But she had an experience being in Neiman Marcus and walking around Neiman Marcus and having someone just kind of shadowing her. And she said, "Oh, can I help you?" And the woman said, "Oh, no, I'm just here to see if you need anything." And she's like, "Oh, well, you don't seem to be seeing if anybody else needs anything. Only you're looking to see if I need something." And my stepdaughter had asked me a question, well, what does it mean? What does racism mean? And I used that as an example to say, well, this woman stereotyped Miss Shalita because she saw her as a Black woman, and that automatically she thought in her mind she's up to no good.
Right.
And then she said, well, that's not very nice. Like, right? That's the simplest thing, right? And it's so true. So, but that's made me think so often though when I'm in these public spaces and I try to be an empathetic person in general. I hope I am. But I think it's made me feel even more so and more aware of situations where that I maybe wouldn't think about as much before, where, if you may be the only Black person in the room, or you may be, the only, whatever, in a situation where you feel kind of what that must feel like to be in that situation, what that must feel like to be that person. And feel that you're perhaps always being judged. So, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to add something?
Well, I just sort of two thoughts with that. I mean, I think obviously, this year has been a year in which, lots of faculty have been having conversations with students, parents have been having conversations, hopefully, with their children, positive and constructive conversations with their children. I'm reminded of recently taking my 3 young kids out to a park, and there was a gate, sort of around this park by a school, and my kids were saying, Dad, let's hop the gate, let's go in, and I'm like, well, Daddy's not very good at that kind of thing. Daddy will probably fall and break himself. Let's not do that. And basically the oldest is sort of why, sort of what's going to happen, are the police going to come, or sort of that kind of thing. And I said, maybe they are. And I try to be always open and honest with my kids as much as I can. And I said, yeah, they might come. And they said, well, what's going to happen? And I said, well, in all honesty, Daddy's white, so probably not much. They'll probably just tell Daddy not to do it again, and just make sure you go. And my 5-year-old, who is wise beyond her years, goes, Daddy, what if you were black? And so then that led to a whole separate discussion, sort of that kind of thing. And then the other thing, to kind of meld what you've been talking about and what Jim has been talking about as well, is in thinking about the United States in the era of World War I, so from 14 until we joined the war in 17, until 1919. Part of my research for my dissertation has been all about the what's called the State Council of Defense of Illinois, and it's this organization that kind of brings together all of these state administrative bodies and the federal the federal sort of bureaucracy for the war, the Committee of Public Information, all of that, and all the philanthropic organizations. So basically, it's this big tent government, right, that brings everything together.
Want to explain the Committee on Public Information, because people might not know?
Sure. So for those who are not familiar, it's kind of the propaganda arm of the federal government during the First World War. The whole idea was the American public needed to be told what is the objective of the war, really what are we fighting for, and then getting that out really across all of the social medias that existed at that time. Now, of course, they have posters, we have memes, sort of that kind of thing. But the idea was typically in the conversation about what are we fighting for, right? That goes to the question of what does it mean to be an American, and what is the role of the state in articulating what it is that we're fighting for. And so, thinking about the poetry there and about this question of blackness in 1917, 1918, 1980, is that the state very clearly, very, very clearly articulates in this particular period that the ideal American is white. That the ideal American is a guy, is a man as well, but that the ideal American is white. And so, I think that that's sort of an interesting backdrop to all of kind of what we're sort of talking about here and what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think it's also
go ahead.
But I think it's also pertinent to bring into the discussion, right, that as with every other conflict from the Declaration on, African Americans served. And that plays into this. I mean, one of the more poignant sections of the book that stood out to me were when these white gangs were trying to ride into the black neighborhoods, and the men were defending their homes. And the same thing happens, a few years later in Tulsa with the Tulsa riots, when a young man is accused of sexually assaulting a white elevator operator, an African American man. And again, there's another sort of commonality we see across time, right?
Being an operator elevator while black, basically.
The idea of youth. It's routinely in all these tragic occurrences, right? It's youth. And oftentimes, like when you were talking about the poem about drowning earlier, made me think of Emmett Till, right? Again, a youth, and his mother warns him, this may not be safe, this may not be a good idea. And a lot of times, I mean, and maybe it's me, there were a lot of things that my mother warned me to do, or not to do, I should say, that I did. And sometimes I came home with resultant injuries. Uh, but I never had to worry about, like, if I walked, as to speak to what you were saying, Josh, I never had to worry about, like, if I went a few blocks over from my house, I may not come back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Or
that's a
to a
whole,
construction site. Sorry, Jim, excuse me.
yeah,
To a construction site that you're jogging and you just happen to see this construction site and you've done that before, walked in it. This is how it's going to look like, right? You never had to think about that.
right, yeah. But again, like this, so youth is a part of it, but also what was interesting to me with Tulsa, so lynch mob forms, and the sheriffs actually tried to protect this African American youth, right? And then the men from the black community in Tulsa, which was itself, as you both know, fairly affluent because of the oil industry in the Sound. But they came, and many of them were World War I veterans, and they were bringing their guns with them, and they offered to stand guard. So I think we also start to see this, you know, um, well, actually, again, in many instances, and I think it's interesting how this falls out of the history when my focus is the American Revolution, and you have African American troops um, from the first and second Rhode Island, and many of these men go on to be farmers and so forth, and they are, pardon the expression, but I think it's very apropos, whitewashed out, right? We don't talk about it. John Lawrence from South Carolina, son of Henry Lawrence, who was one of the members of the Continental Congress and a slave owner. John wanted to raise a black unit for South Carolina to help defend the state, and that never happened. It was shut down. But what's really interesting is, of all the founders in South Carolina, the Laurens are the only ones who do not have any monument. So again, the history that is remembered, the history that is preserved, and what is effaced, what is removed over time.
Jim, before I was going to pivot to another thing in the book, but actually you both just reminded me of that. Bringing up Tulsa, I cannot remember where I watched it. It might have been that same. There's a documentary I was bringing up to you guys before on Amazon Prime called, I think it's called The Uncomfortable Truth, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's there's a young man talking about learning history and having no idea about Tulsa. And like hearing it for the first time, he's like, "What? Like, I grew up in Tulsa. I've known, like, I thought I knew all about Tulsa. I've never heard this in school, and now to hear this as an adult, like, it's really jarring. Maybe it wasn't from the documentary, regardless, but it's the idea of what kind of history are we teaching? It alludes to that point again. Are the things that we have always left out because of, again, who was writing the history at the time, and who was basically teaching it in our colleges and in our schools and whatever, to know. I mean, and this is a little bit different, obviously.
If it's okay, I think kind of building off what both of you were saying, right? So when it comes to thinking about sort of this teaching of history and building off of this poetry and thinking about this story sort of connecting all the way to now, right? Certainly this has been a year of discussions around Confederate monuments and discussions of this kind of thing. And there's, I think, sort of 2 points to make with this, right? you know Monuments aren't history, right? Monuments are, a virtue signaling in granite form, right? They're a statement on the part of the public, making a value judgment about something, a positive value judgment about something, right? A section of the public making a value judgment sort of about something. And they, I think, as well as particularly K through 12 curricula, because when we're talking about sort of knowledge about things like Tulsa, or say Springfield in 1908, or say Detroit during World War II, or the Harlem riot, during World War II, right? There are many individuals who know this history and have written on this history extensively. It just happens that Many of them happen to be not white, and they're not invited to write the K through 12 textbook. And you have then the power as well of the lost cause movement, which we're all familiar with, but for those who are not, right, the lost cause movement, right, is started really in the wake of the Civil War by Southern whites. To try to look back upon their objectives and on the American South and on the Confederacy as a measure of pride, right? To be prideful in what they did. And their movement has so ingrained itself within the American story over the last century and a half that it has become history for many because it's what they've been taught. You need to take Toledo out of it and Springfield out of it, right? It's why, World War II becomes this idea of everybody coming together. That's good. Many folks came together, but, there's also this other reality that's going on here. One of the most common tropes that lost cause folks like to bring forward is they argue that what tens of thousands, right, of African Americans served in the Confederacy, right? None of that's true. That's a lie. There's no actual evidence to bear that out, right? But if you look on the website of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, right, when they have freely downloadable curricula for middle school teachers, right, what's there? A story about Black Confederates and racial harmony in Alabama and all this other nonsense that existed. It didn't exist at that time. So, I think that that's a good part of this too, right? In as much as, this is to bring it back to that earlier point with these poems, right? If the point of this is to, engage people, right? It's trying to engage folks because, what do we have to get past? What do we have to get around, right? We have to get around multiple generations that were force-fed the lost cause.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, to augment that, as dear leader Vladimir Putin, history should be positive. So keep that in mind. That's why we're erasing history of gulags throughout Russia, because history should be positive. So that's why happy slaves were serving in the Confederate Army. Just happy to be there. So happy to serve.
This line sort of plays into just after the Belle Isle riots in 1943 in Michigan. Joseph Goebbels gave a speech wherein he said, and I quote, "You see, we don't have race problems in Germany."
God.
Well, no, but there's a really profoundly evil reason you don't.
Another problem going on there. Which actually, it's funny you should say that, because and we could maybe come back to that quote, but there's there's a Hannah Arendt quote in the book about the most evil is done by the people who never make up their minds to be good or evil, and we can come back to that. But I was going to say, if it's okay with you, I was going to pivot to kind of a similar theme. I think we could talk about still similar things, but something else in the book. Is that okay with both of you?
Yeah.
Quick pause. You might want to edit out, Amanda, us giving our twisted historical humor.
Oh no, that's the best part. They got to keep that in.
Go ahead, Mark.
Comrade, just always know that it should be positive. Anyway, okay, so
Comrade.
Another one of the poems that resonated, and I was telling you guys before, I'm not much of a poetry person. My office mates, who are all comm faculty, literature faculty, I see that one to them, that is their area of expertise. But the poem talks about the idea of removing the problem, right? The problem being, the Black slave who's in this country. What do we do with them? We have to remove the problem, remove them back to Africa, right? Because the people who are here now still, know where they came from in Africa. But I find it's ironic that and I think we still continue to do this, that the onus is on basically the victim as opposed to on the perpetrator. In this case, so the idea that they're the problem, right? Not that slavery began in 1619. Here we began bringing over people against their will, but it's the idea that that they're a problem that need to be gotten rid of. It's their fault almost. And I don't know if I'm taking that too far, or if you both agree with that. But
I do.
Yeah.
It does seem to be a bit of it. It just seems to me that there's there have been so many opportunities in history, in American history, that have been wasted. And I look at when I think of what's going on now in 2020, or I look at even poverty rates proportion to the populations and amounts of incarceration amongst Blacks and Hispanics, particularly for Black Americans. And I think about, kind of what happens post-Civil War, right? And this opportunity that was there, that, for this 40 acres and a mule, or this opportunity to own some land and perhaps to kind of gain a footing in society, and what that could have meant moving forward had that taken place. I mean, and there are multiple wasted opportunities, but and we were talking before about the different civil rights acts of the time and how they passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, but they were never enforced until 100 years later. Just 100 years, no big deal. But just that, what could that have meant, I think, for the Black experience in this country, had Reconstruction been treated differently, and had that opportunity been given, as opposed to, let's just go back to the way that things were as best as we can, but not call it slavery, just kind of twist the name a little bit, and call it Black codes and, Jim Crow laws, etc. So,
sure, unless Jim wants to jump.
I mean, I think we're both ready to go on this one, but yeah, it always sort of shocks my students when I tell them about, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and how it basically paraphrases what becomes the 14th Amendment. But then it takes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for this to even really begin, because again, and I think one of the problems too is that when I teach modern American history, it's like, well, no, it's not like LBJ, which again is its own really interesting sort of irony, right? Here's the white Texas Democrat breaking away from the Solid South, and I think and shattering the New Deal coalition in the process, because he felt that this was the right thing to do, which again I think is a great, Now, granted, in many, many other ways, LBJ is a profoundly flawed individual, and I'm not going to try and lionize him, but he did.
Don't say that to Robert Caro.
But who is it?
Sorry.
Yeah. Not that we ever get off
He was
track.
flawed, but he did. Yeah,
he did the right thing on that occasion. But the idea that two things: one, that just because he signs this piece of legislation does not mean that Jim Crow ends. Does not mean that the violence in the South ends. It takes about another, really, at least decade of this being something the federal government is going to do. That the federal government takes upon itself. But also that okay, so there's this century of just missed opportunity, right? Like where the North kind of turns its back on, right? Simply because a combination of things, right? The scandals of Grant's second administration, the economic downturn, the depression of the late 19th century that starts in 1873, and very successful propagandizing on the part of Southern whites to emphasize, to point out all the flaws, right? To point out all the places where to make a story that Reconstruction isn't working the way the North wants it to, right? To spin it, which again goes back to, and Josh, to your point, right? I think another thing that is important in the way history is presented is, bringing up the fact that Texas is the 9th largest textbook market in the country, which brings with it a huge amount of power over publishers. To say this is how we will, not just what we want in the textbook, but how we want it. There was and I'm sure both of you remember reading about this a few years ago. The Texas Board of Education altered one of their U.S. history textbooks to read. It had read, the American Civil War was fought over slavery, regional difference, economic considerations, and it went from that to the American Civil War was fought over states' rights, which I always say to my students was the perception by some states that you had the right to own people.
Right, states' rights
that's because it really is obviously slavery, right? But states' rights, economic differences, regionalism, and oh yeah, oh there was that slavery thing we should put at the end. But the positioning of words,
Small
right?
print, tiny print.
Right, de-emphasize what, for anyone who even comes to the American Civil War objectively with no knowledge and looks at it and goes, hold it, this is really about slavery.
Slavery. Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
No,
No,
go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Josh.
Jessica.
I can
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
who got first.
To build on what Jim was saying, and to kind of go back to what Mary was saying as well. Both of these sort of lines of conversation and thought have me thinking about really sort of a couple of things. I mean, coming from Illinois, coming from the land of Lincoln, coming from all of this, right? I'm sure both of you have seen in your classes, both at Moraine and anywhere else, the idea of, the usual K through 12 line is what, right? Is that the South is bad because the South believed in slavery, and generally, yeah, they're bad. They believe in slavery, but the North was for freedom, so that means everybody in the North believed in equality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at least for me, one of the most difficult things I have when I talk in the first half of the American survey is getting folks to disconnect the support for abolitionism with
Right.
the idea of racial equality. Just because you might think that slavery's bad
Mm-hmm.
has no bearing on whether or not the person actually thinks that those who are not white deserve a place within the American story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
the role of the American colonization society, right, in the years before the Civil War, right, I think is powerful and important, right? Is the, folks who are saying absolutely slavery's bad. We need to get rid of slavery, but yet at the same time saying, nope, nope, anybody who is of African ancestry, they got to go. And we'll help pay for it, sort of and that kind of thing. And individuals like Andrew Jackson and Lincoln and others, right, are at different points, of course, associated with this,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's sort of one sort of interesting aspect of this. And then the other one is, I think that, with these poems, right, sort of with our understanding of it, right, we need to be thinking more and shaping this conversation more about white anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that that's really a big part of this. I mean, Jim, you mentioned youth earlier, as a measure for driving a lot of this. Youth, I would say, attached to anxiety. I would say, what are a lot of these actions about, but anxious white men. What is much of the initial KKK about, but concerns over preserving white female purity, right? Sort of these anxious white men who want to sort of do these things, right? You're talking post Civil War, Mary, and I'm thinking of and Jim as well, and I'm thinking of, was it Family Guy? The TV show tried to have a comment on this a while back, and it had a individual who looked enslaved, a white individual who looked like the owner. Right, he unlocks his chains, and the two step away a little bit, and the white man looks to hit the enslaved individual and goes, "We're cool now, right?" Which to me I think is, of course, the pop cultural sort of 21st century way to kind of comment on that, right? But they're making a statement about anxiety, right? And it is that anxiety, I think, that gets us to conversations about 2020 and about conversations about tactics of protest, or tactics of opposition, and what folks are okay with, what folks are not okay with.
Mm-hmm.
Because, these days, most folks will say they're for something, but what does that really mean in terms of the tactics of achieving it, right? Sort of the brass tacks of that. And we can, take that back to the 60s, right? Again, the same thing when it comes to anxiety about different stuff, because you can have folks who are anti-war, but they're still going to be sexist and as misogynistic as hell. You can still have folks who say they're pro Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 1965, but they're definitely not for the ERA. There's sort of those aspects to it too. So that white anxiety, particularly white male anxiety, I think is a big part of this.
Abolitionists who were okay with abolition of slavery, but not okay with women's suffrage.
Right.
We saw that a lot too.
Well,
Well, Oh,
And it was
okay.
really interesting, Josh, as we were talking back to your first point. One of the things I found too, those um, soldiers in the first and second Rhode Island, as you both know, at the end of the war, right, they get bounty lands. But where are those lands? They're out in the Ohio Valley. Like, okay, you're manumitted, you're free, go over there, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Being the
where
problem.
you're going to be, where you're going to be out of sight. And again, uh, demonizing the victim, right? Here you
Yeah.
have agreed to fight because the white merchants in Rhode Island weren't going to leave their businesses or their farms for 8 years, but we'll give you basically your freedom and maybe the chance, if you don't die, probably of disease, um, some bounty lands out here on the periphery, but that's all you'll get.
Hmm.
You know.
Hmm. I think, like, kind of piggybacking off of both of you, I started thinking about this notion of anxiety that you were both talking about. I think part of that, or maybe a lot of it, is connected to the idea that we've never come to terms with all this as a country. We've never had, like, sort of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission like they did in South Africa.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know what we're talking about, at the end of apartheid in South Africa, which was very, very similar to our system here, the end of segregation there, apartheid literally was the way to the new government under Nelson Mandela, the first Black president of South Africa, instead of saying, okay, removing the problem, right? White people get out, which is what Robert Mugabe did next door in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia. He said, no, you have to stay, and we all need to work together. But we can't work together and move forward unless there's some kind of a reckoning with the past. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to bring forward a victim of police brutality. And if the police officer in question is willing to participate as well, because it was contingent upon that, the two of them come together essentially, and the victim addresses him and vice versa. They go back and forth, and they basically decide what is the right course of action. And I get it. There are a lot of different, like, cultural differences between ourselves and South Africa, and that make it possible in South Africa that would be more difficult here. But I think there's such, I mean, excuse me, the pun, but such truth to it, right? There's a reason why it's called it. Because you can't move forward. You cannot move forward unless you get past. And you can keep putting band-aids on bullet holes. I'm sorry, pardon the horrible pun, everywhere you go. But those bullet holes obviously keep happening for real. And if we don't address it, what are we going to do? And I feel like I was heartened to see that at Moraine that we are going to actually start having that conversation ourselves, because I think it's been a long time coming. But people are afraid to have that conversation. They're afraid. I think it's understandable. People don't want to offend somebody else. They're afraid to say something. They may have the best of intentions, but they're afraid that they're going to say something that will offend another person. But unless we can kind of create a space that feels comfortable enough and safe enough for people to be able to talk, and which sometimes things might come out the wrong way or may not be said, perfectly, but if that person is not, punished for saying that, we're not going to ever be able to move forward. At least in my mind, a long way to go still with that. Sorry, go ahead.
What I was going to say, kind of is, of course, agreeing with you and saying that, my first thought in coming, to this while you're talking was, in thinking about how, like, if I'm going to be asked to give a public talk about something,
Mm-hmm.
right? I obviously give off a certain vibe. I obviously give off a certain sort of, look. I'm obviously sort of equated with a sort of certain identity. The assumption, if I'm going to give a public talk, is that generally I'm going to do it to a largely white audience in a library or something somewhere. And that largely I'm not going to say anything offensive. I'm not going to say anything mean. I'm not going to use a naughty word. I'm not going to say anything that everybody disagrees with or isn't nice, right? That everybody's, and in some ways it's expected of me then to make sure, to bring it back around to your comment about Putin, that it's positive, right? That it's an overly positive story. And I think it goes, to the other part of this conversation, right? So these are, the purpose of this poetry is for us to get a sense of this experience, if we're not Black, and to get it, understand, kind of just a little about what these individuals endured, how they lived their lives, how they experienced this kind of thing, because of the history that they have sort of been, sort of word to. And the other thing that I sort of was thinking about with this is not only the coding of my lecture, right, is the idea of, I try often, because I know I will get equated with like, oh, Fulton's a purveyor of sort of daddish history, right? Trying to sneak in some equity as much as I can of the idea of, telling folks it's okay to talk about things that aren't positive, but yet at the same time be prideful of something, right? The idea that it's okay to say that you're prideful about where you're from, but also be realistic and honest about where you're from. Am I happy that we won World War II? Yeah, because Nazis are bad. But
Good people on both sides, Josh, just saying.
No.
Sorry, I couldn't resist it for that one.
I know.
Sorry.
But it's it's possible for me to say, am I prideful that we won? Did a lot of good things come out? Yeah. Are we perfect in this process? No, we're not. And it's okay to be open about that. And for us, it is. For other folks, it's not. And I think that's what part of that conversation is, right? It's about what does the politicization of history mean for us versus what does it mean sort of for other folks? I mean, we largely, of course, within our, higher education environment have a certain measure of freedom of, as long as we generally tell the truth within this set period of time and we hit what our objectives are, we can kind of go wherever we want with it. Whereas for folks in a K through 12 environment, obviously that's a little bit more circumscribed.
Sure.
And who has the oversight in that, not just in Illinois, but in Texas, to Jim's earlier point, or other states as well. But
yeah. And if we can't agree on a shared reality, which seems to be the problem. So in other words, how do we come to a common truth, if we can't even agree on what's a basic shared reality? And I think that's one of the biggest fundamental problems that we have right now. And because we can't even agree on that. So how do you agree on what is history and what's quote unquote factual if people can't even agree on a basis of reality, right? Going back to the slavery thing and the reasons for the Civil War.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to chime in on one of the points both of you had made too. When we have, as you were mentioning, Mary, having this discussion of race and equity at the college among our colleagues, I don't necessarily know that there is a way to create a comfortable space. And I always tell my students when we talk about slavery in the U.S. History Survey, look, I realize most of you probably aren't going to want to talk about this. It's a very uncomfortable topic. I don't think it should be a comfortable topic. We're talking about humanity's inhumanity to itself. Like and I think if we can accept the idea that, yeah, these are going, and again, I agree though wholeheartedly with the idea that yes, if you misspeak or if we're an institution of learning. Where else are you going to be able, or should you be able more to experiment with and to learn from misspeaking, misunderstanding? Not if we're not telling students or sharing with students the tools that we've been given over the years of how to express ourselves and how to express those points, as uncomfortable as they may be.
Yes.
What in fact are we doing as an institution of higher learning?
Absolutely, Jim. And when I said safe, I didn't mean like the idea of a safe space, because I think you both know me well enough to know that I don't like the idea of safe spaces. What I meant was, but yeah, just the idea that I write a caveat in my syllabus, and I go into depth and say, we don't all come from cookie cutters, and I want to hear your opinions, because I often learn from my students. It's usually like pop culture references that I have zero clue about that they teach me about, but I want to know their perspectives and where they come from. But I can get them to open up about these topics that are uncomfortable to talk about. talking about race relations or the upcoming election or whatever it might be, unless I create an atmosphere where they feel that it is comfortable enough for them to say it. And then if they do misspeak, and it's students like, a couple of other students, kind of jump in and all over that person that's maybe made that comment, I immediately will diffuse that, because I said that, let them talk, because otherwise that person's not going to want to open up their mouths again and say something. And they're trying to get to that point perhaps where, that light bulb might go off and they might start thinking about something differently. But if you can't get them to open up to begin with, you're never going to reach that point. So that's what I meant when I said.
No, I wasn't. I
you weren't saying it, but I wanted to qualify it myself. So.
No, I think Mary, you and I are both birds of a feather on this, I think. So.
Yeah. Well, and excuse me, I'm sorry if I share my opinions with my students, because I tell them, you're in college. You're not 15-year-olds. You're not 10-year-olds. I think you can manage to have an opinion. You can manage to disagree with me. But again, I make it comfortable enough where they know that they're never being graded on their opinions. They're just being they're graded on their ability to convey their opinion. And I think I hope I do a pretty decent job of making them feel comfortable enough to do so, because I've had students that are the completely polar opposite of me politically, retake my classes again. So I think that maybe is a sign that they know that they're in a safe space, that they can speak freely and know that. So, but where else will you have that exchange of ideas otherwise?
And I think, to build on what both of you are saying, this goes, of course, to the importance of academic freedom, particularly in higher education. Typically, if I'm going to be teaching the first half of the American Survey, right? If I'm, Jim's obviously the expert when it comes to the American Revolution, but when I, in a pre-COVID era, if I'm talking about the 1760s and sort of that politically charged environment, kind of leading up, into the revolution, talking about, political protests and sort of what's okay and what's not okay. What I usually do is I have students, since I'm not a writer of poetry. I tried once when I was 12 and it was very bad. It was mostly, poems about Sega, just they don't really work. Sega and GI Joes, it's not good. And baseball cards, it's not good. Ode to bad baseball card gum, it's bad. But what I usually try to do is I try to get students into groups and have them talk about what they consider to be an acceptable tactic or form of protest, and it's with the idea being of most of them will say you can't basically, many of them will say you can't do anything that would infringe upon the life of anybody else in any way, shape, or form and how they're leading it. To which I sort of go, oh, okay, well, you're against the founding of the country then, in many ways. And it can become a little charged. I've had students, say, incredibly uncomfortable things, and, including, especially in recent years after Colin Kaepernick and the proclivity for folks more recently to kneel during the national anthem, right, as a more sort of common form of protest, and sort of what that meant, say, akin to the 70s and early 80s of maybe burning the flag, right, or sort of that kind of thing, and how charged of an environment that is. And to your point, Mary, about sharing opinions, sort of this kind of thing of, and letting students know, right, sort of what it's okay for someone in my position or your position in the classroom to do, right, what it's all right to do, that it's absolutely okay. Because some will get upset, right? Some will sort of say, well, you can't tell us that. You can't say that. No, actually, I can. Whether I choose not to is up to me. I don't tend to that often. But what I try to make it clear is what's the boundary of what's okay and what's not okay. To try to say, maybe I'm not often comfortable with sharing this, that, or the other, but it's absolutely okay for faculty members to do that. And that is part of that measure of being in college, of being, sort of in a, having the safety to be uncomfortable, sort of that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's a nice, that's kind of a nice way to put it. We're at 2:05, so I don't know if we are kind of, I think it's about 55 minutes that we've been going for, or 50 minutes now.
I think so.
is there anything that anyone else wants to add, like in terms of just kind of maybe some closing thoughts about what we talked about, or do we leave it there with you, or we just kind of that we have safety in our classroom? It's a safe space for you to be able to open up and express yourself. And anyone want to add anything to that? I know it's kind of, we've been talking before. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Sure. I mean, the only thing I would say is if you're someone who has been listening to this and you're interested in that kind of thing, outside of taking our classes, uh, you know,
Plug.
I would say, they're one of the wonderful parts about the 21st century, right, is of course the wide proliferation of resources, right? So, if you heard part of this discussion about white privilege or white anxiety or blackness or sort of this kind of thing, and you've been wondering sort of more about them, right? There's many, 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 many wonderful resources that you can check out freely, both from the Moraine Library or from your local library to learn a lot more, right, about sort of these kinds of things. The University of Chicago put together a great digital map on 1919 in Chicago, and where every single racial incident was going on during the riots and everything sort of that was happening, right? Digital mapping software for, for those events. That would be a great resource for someone who's really interested in this poetry. We have Eyes on the Prize, right? The documentary series from the 80s, right? From looking at sort of race relations from the 50s through the 70s, right? American Experience, right? The Jim Crow Museum on racial sort of stereotypes from Ferris State University. There's lots of wonderful resources to go and learn more.
And even the report, sorry, Mary, but even that report that many of these poems are based off of is available free to you as a PDF file online. You can check it out for yourself and see how this commission looked at things with your own eyes, and evaluate their findings for yourself. And I think that's kind of the key that we're after, is that, we use this as a starting point to initiate the discussion and to look into these things. But really, developing the viewpoint is up to every individual to do for themselves in the end.
Sure. I was going to say, and I hope this is not like a Debbie Downer comment to end this with, but I'm noticing that we alluded briefly to people like George Floyd or Jacob Blake or Elijah McClain, but we haven't talked that much about it in our conversation. But I think the point of it is that all of this is so interrelated that it hasn't stopped. So what we're talking about, Eugene Williams, correlates completely with what just happened to Jacob Blake the other day. So I just, I don't know. I don't want to be on a depressing note, but that's just kind of where it leaves me.
Well, and I think it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be depressed, right? And it's okay, to then read more and do more, and to channel that, and to do what you can, right? What was it? Maybe it's just because my kids watch so much of it now on Amazon Prime, but reading Rainbow, don't take my word for it, sort of that kind of phrase. That it's, I think that does have meaning here. Go out and do things, right? Get involved, right? Get active. If you feel, sort of, concerned about this, and want to do more, then do more.
Right. Absolutely. Yep.